I'd like to yield time to my good friend Cynthia Loomis from Wyoming, and I would yield as much time as she would consume.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman from New Mexico for yielding. I appreciate his leadership of the Western Caucus and look forward to this robust discussion tonight. The West is rich in natural resources, and natural resources, their good stewardship and using them for the benefit of our country is what the West does best. This administration is turning its back on the stewardship that is available in the West as we produce our natural resources, and instead is taking away the jobs, the environmental progress, and replacing it with further dependence on foreign energy from places like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. We can produce our own energy in this country between the resources of Canada and the United States. We can produce enough energy for us to meet our foreseeable needs. But that requires us to use the technologies and the jobs associated with those technologies that will create tens of thousands of jobs, in fact, hundreds of thousands of jobs. Instead, we're actually going in exactly the opposite direction. Let me give you an example. Fracking technology is advancing dramatically the ability of America to recover its rich natural gas resources. And it allows us to do so by casing a well with perforations. There is an explosion that cracks the tight sands or the rock. Then fluids are forced into these gaps in the rock, keeping the seams open, allowing this gas or oil to percolate back up the well casing and be produced, allowing Americans to use American-grown energy. But the attack on fracking technology is based not on science, but on the idea that fracking could damage drinking water. None of us want to see our precious drinking water polluted by contaminants that some people believe are being used in fracking fluids. So the states, knowing their own geology better than anyone in Washington could, and the very diverse geology that is different from state to state. You're going to be hearing later this evening from G.T. Thompson, a member of Congress from Pennsylvania, where the Marcellus Shale Formation is being produced. I am going to talk about the use of fracking technology in my state, where the geology is very different from the Marcellus Shale, but where it can be used in a responsible manner to produce American oil and gas with American jobs. The Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, recognizing the concern that our drinking water could be imperiled, set about and created a set of rules and regulations to disclose the contents of fracking fluids and the processes that are being used by companies that are fracking wells in the state of Wyoming. Those rules are being used to provide people with the information that's needed to assure them that fracking fluids are not contaminating our water. Furthermore, there have been repeated stories, using an example from Wyoming, in Pavilion, Wyoming, of an area that some argue was fracked to the detriment of local water wells. Well, we're learning more and more about those water wells. And what we're finding is out of over 100 water wells in the area, only about a fifth of them are permitted, and some of them are not even cased. Well, this allows for the natural percolation of gas into water that has nothing to do with fracking. If we look at the science and apply it correctly using good stewardship principles, we can produce oil and gas and have good drinking water. I even have a photograph from someone in my home state, Mr. Chairman, that has a flame coming out of a pond. The flame is a consequence of a natural methane seep coming out of the water that has been on fire as long as this gentleman can remember. These are natural phenomenons. We need to make sure that we are assuring people in this country that drinking water will be safe at the same time we recover these resources. Those very assurances require scientists, they require environmental companies, they require fracking experts, more jobs, more oil and gas, more diverse energy for the American economy. And of course, clean-burning natural gas provides us also an extension of the air quality that we value so well. These are American jobs that can be saved, nurtured, and grown and used successfully all over the United States, on and offshore. And Mr. Chairman, you just acknowledged a project in the Beaufort Sea, which is off the coast of Barrow, Alaska, 87 miles. Shell has put $4 billion, as you pointed out, into preparing to produce that resource, and still does not have a permit to produce it. And at some point, those investments begin to devalue their sunken costs in a way that may make companies like Shell look elsewhere. That takes jobs away from America and into countries where we're competing for jobs, and in places that sometimes are not our best friends when it comes to foreign policy and human rights. So, Mr. Chairman, let's produce oil and gas with American jobs, with good pay, with good benefits, and with the residual goal of having an all-of-the-above energy policy that benefits the West and the country as a whole. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for her comments, and we're joined tonight by my good friend Mr. Thompson from Pennsylvania. Before I yield time to him, I'd like to walk through just a brief list of some of the other ways that the government conducts war on Western jobs. Consider the listing of endangered species. No one of us wants to see a species be extinct or go extinct, but what we've seen is an extreme interpretation of the rules which kill jobs at the same time. I think that there are ways that we could keep jobs and preserve species, yet we're not doing that right now. The coho salmon was listed as endangered. As a result, the farmers in the Klamath Basin in Oregon have been forced into bankruptcy due to prohibitions on water use by the listing of the salmon. The Methow salmon, water rights holders in the Methow Valley of Washington lost the use of their water, and property owners and timber owners face restrictions on their properties because of the imposition of egregious stream buffers to protect the listed salmon. The listing of the salmon in general, the court case over whether hydroelectric dam operators have done enough to prevent the deaths of salmon in Washington and Oregon. Billions of dollars have been spent to accommodate, according to the Bloomberg Business Week, but the environmental groups continue to sue. The northern spotted owl, the listing has killed the entire timber industry in much of the West, especially Northern California and Oregon. The Mexican spotted owl, that listing also killed the timber industry in New Mexico and Arizona. Hundreds of thousands of jobs have been lost. The Delta smelt, the listing of that species, a small two-inch fish that lives in the San Joaquin Valley, killed 27,000 jobs there. The San Joaquin Valley was the source of 80% of our nation's vegetables. Now, those vegetable farms are gone. Bankruptcy. We're now importing food from countries that can spray pesticides that are outlawed in this country, so our food supply is less safe. Fewer jobs, bigger government deficit, greater cost of vegetables, and less safe food supply. The gray wolf was listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as endangered and has killed agriculture and mining jobs throughout the West. Still, the list goes on and on. So it's not that these are just hypothetical ideas that the war on Western jobs is occurring by our government. These are ongoing processes. One group, the Center for Biological Diversity, has declared that they're going to list over 1,000 species this year, that they are going to petition for the listing of over 1,000 species this year. Understand that their lawyers get reimbursed at the rate of $350 to $500 per hour for every lawsuit they bring against the government. Every lawsuit that kills jobs provides employment for the lawyers in those groups, so know that the taxpayer is footing the bill and yet losing jobs in the meantime. I'd like to recognize Mr. Thompson now for as much time as he might consume. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Well, I thank my good friend from Hobbs, New Mexico for yielding, and it is representing the part of Pennsylvania. It's an honor to be a part of the Western Caucus. I represent Western Pennsylvania and Central Pennsylvania and a little bit of Eastern Pennsylvania. My district is so large, so rural. It has many of the same issues, Mr. Speaker, that fit very well within the Western Caucus. We have public lands, all these issues you were hearing about tonight in terms of what government does as a huge barrier and to kill jobs. There's the same things that we certainly experience in Western Pennsylvania. Now, I'm proud. I chair the largest committee in a subcommittee of agriculture, conservation, energy, and forestry, and so I want to go down another road in which of how government kills jobs, Western jobs, whether it's the West or Western Pennsylvania or, frankly, throughout the United States. We recently had a hearing reviewing the proposed United States Forest Service plan. And, you know, our national forests it's very clear to differentiate. They are not national parks. Our national forests were created to provide us sustainable resources, predominantly timber. But timber is not the only thing. Our forests were created to provide us energy, access to oil, to natural gas, to coal, to minerals. So that's why they're put in existence. And as we look around the nation, certainly in my congressional district, we have my national forest is relatively small compared to, I think, some in the West, 513,000 acres, but it is profitable and home to the world's best hardwood cherry. It's got a management plan that says you should be able to, in a sustainable way, to keep the forest healthy, they're supposed to harvest over 90 million board feet a year. And yet for over a decade they've been doing 20. There's national forests. One of the members of my subcommittee talked about, Mr. Sutherland talked about his national forest. They harvest 0 board feet out of his national forest. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. First of all, if you don't harvest timber, you don't manage that forest in a healthy way. You subject yourself to wildfires, to invasive species. It creates an unhealthy forest, but it also kills jobs, and that's what we have seen. We have seen that all across the nation, in the West, frankly, all parts of the country with our national forests, where the Forest Service has failed to do its job in terms of managing the forest, I think, in a productive way. And that point came out very clearly in the first of what will be, I think, a number of hearings that we're going to do on this issue. Frankly, timber production is down. Now, I'm proud to say that it's up to 40 million board feet in the Allegheny National Forest, but that's only with persistence of kind of being with the Forest Service almost on a constant basis. But it's still a long ways from 90, and the production of timber is down, and that means timber jobs, first of all. Our sawmills, our timber industry, those jobs, in many parts of the country, those jobs have gone away. They're extinct today. And the forest products jobs that come as a result of having that timber supply are going away. And the economies, you know, our rural communities were taken in order to create these national forests by the federal government. And the economies of our rural communities that make up those forests depended on the promise that was made when the forests were formed, that the timber industry, minerals, oil, gas, coal, all those sustainable resources would be provided, would be produced, and that would maintain the economies of those rural communities. Well, that's been a lie by the federal government. They haven't done that. They haven't met their responsibilities, and that has killed jobs in communities. Well, that's been a lie by the federal government. They haven't done that. They haven't met their responsibilities, and that has killed jobs and killed our economies in rural communities. In terms of energy in my district, I was sworn in for the first time in Congress in January 2009. Within a week of when I was sworn in, the Forest Service chose to place a moratorium on any new drilling permits in my national forest. Now you have to understand, my national forest, 93% of the subsurface rights are privately owned. So these are owned by private individuals even. And they came in and imposed this moratorium because of some lawsuit that, as my good friend talked about, that the taxpayers paid their lawyers, paid the organizations to file, basically. And we went over a year with people losing their jobs, families suffering for just that reason. Now, thankfully, a federal judge overturned that decision. And, of course, the Forest Service appealed, and the federal judge threw it out again. And now the Forest Service has appealed again. They've taken it to a different court, down to the Philadelphia court, and we'll see what turns out there. But that's just another example of just bad government. My good friend, Mrs. Loomis from Wyoming, talked about the Marcellus natural gas, and let me just say, that's all private sector. The government's not involved in it. Natural gas is mostly private lands, and it works. It has created over 88,000 jobs in Pennsylvania. I have counties that, for the first time in history, their unemployment rates are below both state and national averages. Prosperity is a good thing, and everybody benefits, not just the people that are getting the royalties or the leases, but frankly the churches, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Little Leagues, the fire departments, the hospitals. I mean, because rural folks are generous and they support good causes. And so the communities are growing. The annual average tax, annual earnings are going up. Frankly, government's benefiting because local, state, and even the federal government's getting a little more tax revenue by all that economic activity. And unemployment's down, and energy security is there, and it's lower energy costs for everyone. And you know what? It's private sector. If the government owned that land, we'd never be experiencing those benefits. So, you know, and although despite that fact, despite these are private lands, and I'll end my comments with this because I know we've got other members that want to speak tonight, this administration is going after that natural gas production. They are. I mean, there are some in this body that are proposing federal government overreach. I mean, we're accessing that energy as a good steward. We've got regulations. The Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania is a tough agency, but they do a fair job. And they're always looking at their regulations. But we've got this administration who wants the federal government to employ the EPA and to send them into Pennsylvania and other parts of our country where we're producing domestic energy, which will essentially shut down our energy production. And it will shut down this prosperity. We'll shut down these jobs that are being created. We'll shut down the movement that we're making towards energy security. And so I want to thank my good friend from New Mexico for hosting this hour tonight. Proud to be a part of the Western Caucus. Proud to be with you this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, gentleman from Pennsylvania, for his comments. And so far, the quote of the night is that prosperity is a good thing, and yet our government seems to have a war on prosperity. Why is our government trying to undermine the economy when we're struggling with high deficits and unemployment? It defies imagination that that's going on. I'd like to recognize now my good friend from Georgia, Mr. Brown, for as much time as he might consume, and I appreciate you being here. Georgia and Pennsylvania in the Western Caucus, that's the way it should be. We're west of somewhere. Thank you for you being here tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. I appreciate your yielding me some time. But let me go forward with what Mr. Thompson was just saying and what you were just commenting on about prosperity. Just today, I had a businessman in my office relating to me a conversation he had with one of the Democrat senators, liberal Democrat senators, and he was talking about the issues that concerned him and his business. And she was arguing over and over again about how government needs to do all the regulatory constraints on business and how businesses need to be taxed higher, and it's not fair for businesses to be making money and at the levels that they are. In fact, just today we saw some of our Democrat colleagues talk about the oil companies and the kind of money that they've been making with the increased prices of gasoline. And finally, in frustration, this Democrat senator said to this businessman, he says, all you're concerned about is profit. You just want to make a profit. Well, that's what business does. It makes a profit for its shareholders. If it's a corporation, it makes a profit for the small businesses. The policies of this administration, the policies that we've seen from our Democrat colleagues when Nancy Pelosi was running the House, now with Harry Reid running the Senate, and certainly the Obama administration, they're trying to destroy profits. They're trying to destroy our economy, in my opinion. And in fact, the President himself has said that he doesn't mind seeing gasoline prices go up as long as they go up incrementally. He doesn't want to see the massive increases, but as long as they keep going up. His own Energy Secretary, Dr. Chu, fairly recently said, somehow we have to find a way to make gasoline in the United States at the same price that it is in Europe, which is roughly $8 a gallon today. The policies of this administration are doing just exactly that. Today in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, we were talking about fracking. And the EPA scientist that is studying fracking admitted that there's not been one single incident, not one, where fracking has been implicated in contaminating drinking water. Not one. But I believe this administration is doing everything it can to try to destroy energy production in this country and trying to destroy the free enterprise system. And in fact, the President himself said that if his policies go into effect, to use his own words, energy prices will, quote, necessarily skyrocket. Well, who's going to be hurt? Who's going to be hurt when fuel prices go up and food prices go up, and not only gasoline and diesel fuel? I was talking to a restaurant, actually a manager in a restaurant just last week in Athens, Georgia, and asking him about his food prices in his restaurant and what's going on because of the high cost of gasoline. And he said his suppliers are adding a fuel surcharge onto the cost of the foods that he's buying and selling in his restaurant. And it's the policies of this administration that's doing that. Just yesterday, I had a constituent of mine who's an egg producer in Georgia come in and talk about some of the issues that he faces. Now, I am from Georgia. I'm a good Southerner, and I love my grits and cornbread. Now, for folks who are not Southerners, grits are made from corn. And cornbread, obviously, that's self-explanatory where that comes from. I think even Yankees will know that cornbread comes from corn, too. So the thing that I, as a good Southerner, I just cannot see driving down the road burning up my grits and cornbread in the fuel tank of my GMC Yukon that I used as my office, actually, when I was making house calls as a medical doctor. I hear our Democrat colleagues talk about we need to remove the subsidies for the oil companies. Well, the American people need to know that those subsidies are actually tax credits. They're not true subsidies as such. In fact, Harry Reid was recently wanting a subsidy for gold mining in his home state of Nevada. He also wanted us to continue funding the Cowboy Poetry Festival in his home state. we've got to stop spending those outrageous funds that the federal government's been spending, and we need to start creating jobs in a strong economy. And the best way to do that is get rid of these policies of this administration that are destroying jobs, destroying our economy, increasing the cost of gas and diesel fuel for farmers and everybody in this country. But back to my agri-producer friend, I've got a chart here that we made up in our office. A dozen eggs in Georgia. We have the subsidies for, which are really not subsidies for the oil companies, they're just tax credits. But we have subsidies for ethanol production, which are true subsidies. And our administration is trying to pick winners and losers, and one of the winners that they picked is ethanol production. And that's been a total failure. And what's that done? It's increased the cost of gasoline. It's increased the cost of food across this country, too. In fact, the major ingredient in feed for chickens is corn. Corn, when I was farming back a number of years ago, was $2.50 a bushel. Now it's approaching $8 a bushel. In 2005, before this ethanol subsidy, total feed costs per dozen eggs, so when a consumer goes out and buys a dozen eggs, the food cost in that dozen eggs was 21 cents per dozen of eggs. Now, 2011, it's approximately 52 cents per dozen. So who pays for that? Does the egg producer? No. The consumer, when you go to the grocery store and buy a dozen eggs, you're paying more money for the failed policies of this administration, particularly as it has to do with energy. And if we start drilling for oil, tapping into our natural gas supplies, start producing coal, particularly doing the clean coal technology that we have, having an all-above energy policy, what's going to be the outcome, long-term outcome for the American consumer? Every single American. It's going to lower the cost of eggs and milk and bread, because it's going to lower the cost of the production of all the foodstuffs. Every single good and service in this country is affected by these high fuel costs of gasoline and fuel oil, diesel fuel, etc. The people who are going to be hurt most are the poor people, those on limited incomes, our senior citizens. And I hear over and over again our Democrat colleagues talk about Republicans are in the back pockets of big oil. Wrong. I'd like to see us end all subsidies, all of them, but particularly ethanol subsidy, which has not made any sense whatsoever. And let's start developing our own energy resources, which will create jobs here in America. Just yesterday and today, we're debating 3 bills that came out of our Natural Resources Committee. Those 3 bills will start us being able to tap into the energy, God-given energy resources that we have in this country. Help us to be less dependent upon foreign sources for energy. If the President will ever sign those 3 bills into law, the short-term effect is going to be 220,000, I think it's been estimated 200,000 new jobs are going to be created. 200,000 new jobs will be created just with those 3 bills, just to be able to open up developing our own energy resources here in America, that the President is blocking. Long-term, those 3 bills, it's estimated, will create 1.2 million new jobs here in the United States. American jobs. Help create a stronger economy. The policies of this administration, the failed energy policies of this administration, are hurting job creation. They're hurting our economy. They're raising the cost of gasoline. They're raising the cost of diesel fuel. They're raising the cost of fuel oil. They're going to hurt egg producers and thus egg consumers, consumers of all goods and services. Your food costs are going to go up. The cost of every goods and service in this country is going to go up, all because of the failed policies of this administration, because we cannot develop our own energy resources, our God-given resources that we have in this country. I submit if a nation is not energy independent, it's not a secure nation. And that's where we are today. We've got to become energy independent. And how's that going to happen? Former U.S. Senator Everett Dirksen one time said, when he feels the heat, he sees the light. The most powerful political force in America is embodied in the first three words of the U.S. Constitution: we the people. When we the people start contacting members of Congress, particularly the Democrat members of the House and the members of the U.S. Senate, and demanding that we develop our own energy resources here in America, that we have an all-of-the-above energy policy that looks at everything: nuclear energy, alternative sources, clean coal, oil, gas, everything, which we must do. And that's what Republicans are fighting for. If enough people all over this country will contact their senators and their members of Congress and say, let's develop our own energy resources, let's develop American jobs, let's develop a strong economy here in America, then we can do so. But it's up to we the people to be able to demand that from your elected representatives. Thank you, Mr. Pierce, for yielding me some time, and I appreciate the great job you're doing as chairman of the Western Caucus. I'm honored to be a part of that caucus, and I appreciate your yielding me some time tonight.
I thank the gentleman.
And I encourage, before I yield back, I encourage people to go on my website, brown.house.gov, and they can actually look at all the things on this chart, and so they can look at it in fine detail and understand how high energy costs are creating high prices for eggs in their grocery store. Thank you, Mr. Pierce.
Thank the gentleman for his comments and his perceptions. As he mentioned, it seems that Washington has a war on profits. I think that maybe our friends on the other side of the aisle don't understand that profits pay high salaries. If you work in an industry with no profits, you work at low salaries. Profits pay to reinvest in new buildings, creating construction dollars in neighborhoods. Profits are put into youth training, baseball leagues, soccer leagues. Profits are reinvested into new equipment, causing manufacturing firms to thrive. Profits are invested in dividends, and they cause increased values of stocks, helping retirees. And finally, profits are the only thing that corporations pay tax on. They do not pay taxes on losses. And so when we begin to talk about taking away the profits of companies, understand that we're talking about undermining the American way of life. This attack on profits is an attack on the American way of life. I'm pleased to be joined tonight by a good friend from Utah, Mr. Bishop, and would like to yield him as much time as he would consume.
I thank Chairman Pierce from New Mexico for using the Western Caucus to illustrate some of these ideas and situations that are here. I'm also grateful that Mr. Brown from Georgia was just here and tried to show how whenever you have a policy that prohibits or discriminates or lessens the amount of energy that we have in this country, it has a direct impact on individuals and people. As he was showing, it has a direct impact on the cost of food. For every dime that diesel fuel increases, that's $400 million the agricultural industry has to put on to the cost of food. Not just in transporting the food, but for the fertilizer to grow it, for the boxing, the shipping, the manufacturing of it. All of those things are added to it. For every penny that the cost of gasoline increases at the pump, that is $1 billion that's taken out of the household income of Americans. And who is that going to impact the worst? Obviously, the people at the lower end of the economic scale, who have the most difficult time to making their budget stretch to pay for higher transportation costs through fuel, for higher food costs because fuel goes up, for higher heating costs because fuel goes up. They're the ones who are hurt. And they're the ones who are taking place. Now, I also appreciate Mr. Pierce for illustrating that this actually that we have a situation in which the West, without trying to be specific to a region, but the West has been treated with the heaviest hand over the past few years and has suffered the greatest consequences of that heavy hand. Last year, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they simply said that the region that had the highest unemployment for last year and the year before happened to be the West. 6 of the top 12 states that had the largest decline in employment to population ratio since the recession that began in 2007 are found in the West. 3 of the top 5 states showing the most stress last year in the summer were found in the West. And unfortunately, Washington's misguided policies over the last several years are simply making these situations worse. Let me, if I could, talk about a couple of specific situations that I have found in my state that have added to this problem of what we call the war on the West, because they have had the dual whammy of not only increasing the price of energy, which is the price of living and the price of doing business, but at the same time decreasing jobs in our particular area. Part of that becomes because the West simply has, as a region, over half of its land owned by the federal government. This government was not planned this way, it just kind of happened. Owns 1 out of every 3 acres in the United States. But west of Denver, it owns 1 out of every 2 acres in the United States. And we get to have the fun of working with the heavy hand of the federal government on all sorts of efforts, especially when a Department of Interior has unlimited, arbitrary, and capricious powers given to them. For example, the Bureau of Land Management in the state of Utah went through what they are called regional management plans. I have 16 areas, half of them went through a regional management plan. The people on the ground who were working there, who lived there and know that area, spent 7 years in developing a regional management plan, which means, simply, how will the land owned by the federal government, and remember it's still half of it, how will the land be used for development purposes? 7 years, they held the public hearings, they went through all the process, they came up with their plan. The Secretary of Interior came into office, and on the first day, in the first few days, he simply said, those plans don't fit the needs of this country because it authorizes 77 oil and gas leases, places where the professionals on the ground determined that the best use of government land was used to develop oil and gas in the state of Utah. The Secretary simply said no. He believed the last administration had made a rush to judgment, and therefore it was in his best decision to suspend not only those oil leases but also the land management plans at the same time. He did it simply by the stroke of his signature. There was no work with it, there was no counterbalance, there was no checks and balance system. He simply said, I think it was wrong, it was a rush to judgment, I'm going to stop it. Now, like everything else, this situation went to court, and the judge ruled that actually the Secretary was wrong. There was not a rush to judgment by anyone other than the Secretary when he suspended those leases. However, because there was a timing element, one of those technicalities, and those who were suing waited too long to send the lawsuit, the decision of the Secretary would stand. And what the Secretary said is, I'll be magnanimous, and of the 77, I'll let 17 go forward. The other 60, they stay off the table. I don't care what the regional management plan did. The end result of that was simply that you don't have a whole lot of leases that would be put out for development. Unfortunately, it has a ripple effect through the community, because not all leases are found on federal land. There is also state land and very few pieces of private land. But oftentimes they abut one another. And if you block the leasing opportunity on this piece of land, it sterilizes the leasing development opportunity on its neighbor land at the same time. Plus, if all of a sudden the Department of Interior is sending a message that they're going to be tough on this kind of development, industry gets the message, and they're not going to fight that kind of issue, and they will leave at the same time. The net result of this one action by the Department of Interior was unemployment in one rural county in Utah, was a loss of 3,000 jobs in a county that only has 30,000 residents. The unemployment tripled over a course of months, and only and solely because of this one decision. That not only did we not have the ability of drilling on those federal lands, but you also lost the opportunity for the private sector to go into state lands and on certain private lands, and then the ripple effect went. As they realized what simply happened is the private sector said, I'm not going to put up with this. They took the investment capital that they were willing to put into the region of rural Utah and took it somewhere else where they didn't have to deal with the Department of Interior. We have the same situation in the West in another particular area, specifically with oil shale. The U.S. Geological Survey, which oddly enough is part of the Department of Interior, has estimated that in a 16,000 square mile area of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, there are roughly 2 trillion barrels of oil that can be extracted from oil shale. That is more energy than we get from Canada. This is not a new and unusual process. Estonia and the Baltic states has been using this same process of extraction from oil shale for 80 years, and they have done it successfully and in an environmentally friendly manner. We could copy that same proposal. But no, once again, this administration has decided to slow walk any development, slow walk any allowance of projects to go forward to demonstrate what we can and cannot do. And the net result of losing this opportunity for oil shale is at least $1.9 trillion added to the economy of this country and projected to be up to 100,000 new jobs that would be lost simply by this one decision as well. Now, this is a small area, but you compound that fact of what is happening, not just in my state of Utah, but what's happening in Colorado and Wyoming and New Mexico and Nevada and the rest of the West, and you see the compounded problem we have that truly can understand why, in the recession, why was the West the hardest hit? Well, because we were dealing with the federal government in a way that was certainly certainly unfair. I'd like to say one last thing before I yield back to the gentleman from New Mexico. The last days, as the gentleman said, we have been talking about the ability of trying to jumpstart our energy portfolio, our energy self-dependence, our energy ability in 3 bills specifically dealing with offshore development. We have that same potential for energy development onshore as well that we need to talk about at the same time. But sometimes we also need to talk here simply about understanding how words have meaning. And we have been throwing around words in the debate of the last couple of weeks in a way that I think has been somewhat unfair and somewhat dilatory and not quite has clouded the actual issue of what is going on. For example, there are those that are saying we don't need to actually develop any new oil or gas resources. There are plenty of leases out there that aren't being produced. I want you to know when you deal with words that a lease is not the same thing as a permit to drill. And a permit to drill doesn't mean you're going to find anything for production. Just because there is a lease does not mean there is production. I had a company that was in my office today who has a lease in one of the western states. They received the lease 6 years ago. Only this year did they finally check off all the boxes, run through all the bureaucratic hoops, do the environmental impact statements to get the permit 6 years later to finally start preparing to drill to see if it is actually productive. That 6 years cost a lot of money to that company, which could have gone to providing work, providing jobs, as well as resources to help grow the economy of this country. That's a real cost, and that is real and legitimate. We've heard comments before about how this country doesn't have enough oil because we don't have enough reserves to make it worthwhile. According to the CRS, Congressional Research Study, we have $1.2 trillion worth of gas that are available for production here in the United States. That puts us in the top 5 countries in the world for oil. We are not an oil-poor country. However, when we talk about reserves, reserves are not the same thing as the amount of money that's available. Our reserves are a definition that is established by the SEC And by the definition we use, we will always have fewer reserves than other countries by definition. In addition to that, a reserve can't count as a reserve until you can actually get to it. When we put parts of this country off, we have moratorium, by definition, that takes us out of the reserve. So when someone says we don't have as many reserves as other countries, it's probably true. That doesn't mean we don't have enough oil that can be used and produced. It simply means it doesn't fit the definition. Reserve is not the same thing as amount of producible oil. Just like, as the gentleman from Georgia said, a subsidy, and we talked about all the subsidies the industries are getting, a subsidy is when the government actually pays cash to somebody. The oil companies are not getting cash from the government. A subsidy should not be confused with a tax credit or a tax deduction. If it was, when I fill out my long form and I write down my charitable contributions and get to write them off, that means the federal government is subsidizing me or subsidizing the charity to which I am giving it. That doesn't make any sense. What we need to do is talk about the words as the words really are meant to be, and make sure that the words are used the proper way and not for some rhetorical effort to inflame the situation and reach some other result. The last word we need to talk about is simply jobs. Right now, there are twice as many government jobs as in all of manufacturing combined. In 1960, those ratios were reversed. We have gone a lot of efforts over the last 2 years to pass job bills, all of which produced government jobs. What we need to do is look at jobs in the private sector. In the private sector, which creates a reliable long-term job, a job that also equates wealth that goes back into the system and helps to grow our economy and grow our country. Those are the jobs we should be after, and those are the jobs we need to do. And unfortunately, we will never develop those jobs until we have a governmental energy policy that is reliable, that is not dependent on the whims of some foreign country, and that helps us develop the resources that we have in this country. We can do it, and we need to do it. And I appreciate Mr. Pierce from New Mexico bringing up this issue, because that's exactly what we need to do as a policy. With that, I thank the gentleman, and I yield back the time to him.
Thank the gentleman for his comments. He pointed out that this nation is rich in shale oil. We do, in fact, have 2 trillion barrels in reserve in shale. That all was outlawed from use by the American consumer back in 2007 in a bill passed by Nancy Pelosi off of the floor of the House. To put that in perspective, what does 2 trillion barrels of shale oil mean? We have only used 1 trillion barrels of oil completely in our history. We have double in just shale oil. That's not natural gas. That's not normal petroleum. We have double in shale oil what we've consumed up to this point. Another comment that was made earlier is that we subsidize and that consumers end up paying for things that they don't know they're paying. Just talked to a constituent last week, said that he was given a tax credit for 40% of a solar facility that he put on his own home. That was from the federal government. From the state government, another 10%, so about 50% of the cost of the program was completely reimbursed by the government. But the big deal is they're paying him 22 cents per kilowatt hour of energy that he is able to sell back into the system. Now, that 22 cents needs to be compared to the 7 cents that electricity normally costs. So the consumer is tagged with 3 times the cost of electricity that is provided by solar power that is bought from individual producers. The consumer will pay more for the power. It is not an easy process to understand, but consumers will ultimately pay all of the higher energy costs. We hear much today in Washington about the subsidies for big oil. Be aware that there are no subsidies for big oil. There are simply write-offs that every company is allowed to take legally, write-offs to encourage them to invest in machinery, write-offs that sound like depreciation, amortization, write-offs that are allowed by accounting techniques across the board in this country. understand that when we begin to penalize these oil companies, we're going to cost America jobs. So let's talk just a bit about the different supposed subsidies, but in fact legitimate write-offs that companies are given. The suggestion is made that we would want to repeal the expensing of the intangible drilling cost. The intangible drilling cost usually represents 60 to 80% of the cost of a well. Historic U.S. policy allows a deduction for development. That's since 1913 in this government's tax code, and yet today we're talking about reversing it, a time when we're starving for jobs, 9% unemployment, and we're going to talk about making it harder to employ people in this country. Other businesses are able to expense their research and development projects. Pharmaceutical companies, IDC specifically targets U.S. oil and gas companies. It will discourage innovation in the energy sector at a time when we need more innovation, not less. Disallowing the expensing of intangible drilling cost will put the American consumer in a worse position and endanger American jobs. The second idea that's talked about in raising taxes for oil companies is to do away with the write-off, the dual capacity rule. The dual capacity rule is to ensure that income that is taxed by another nation is not also taxed by the U.S. It's something that the U.S. has been alone in taxing double. We tax not only the amount that is made here, but the amount that is made in other countries, the profits made in other countries. That's a tax inversion that has cost us many jobs. Now then, we have the allowance, the dual capacity rule is in place to stop that, and yet our friends on the other side of the aisle are saying that we must stop this practice. All it's going to do is make the U.S. more inhospitable for investments in energy resources at a time when we're seeing $4 gasoline, at a time when our economy is struggling, when we need jobs. We're talking about making American businesses less competitive and making American jobs more scarce. The final section is maybe the most egregious of all. That is the repeal of Section 199, manufacturing exemptions for oil and gas companies. In 2004, the Congress enacted the Section 199 for manufacturing companies to encourage them to bring jobs back to this country. From 2004 to 2007, the oil and gas industry was responsible for 2 million new jobs that were created. The oil and gas companies currently support 9.2 million jobs. Almost all manufacturers receive a 9% credit. That's, again, in order to encourage them to come back to this country. The oil and gas companies have only been receiving a 6% credit because they've already been picked on by the people in this town. But now they're suggesting that we would want to completely do away with the manufacturing credit. Keep in mind, that's the refining of gasoline. That's the definition of manufacturing in oil and gas. So at a time when we're starving for jobs, we're going to make U.S. manufacturers, the U.S. refineries, less competitive. We're going to encourage Venezuela and Hugo Chavez to send more jobs there, to take more jobs, and to send more gasoline here. It just doesn't make sense. Tonight I'd like to wrap up with this one picture about the status that our country is in. Our country right now has a tremendous problem with its economy. The problem is this. In Washington, we spend $3.5 trillion. Our revenues to the government are $2.2 trillion. That's a $1.3 trillion deficit. The accumulated deficits over the lifetime of this country are almost $15 trillion. I show those deficits running out the end of the pipeline into our debt barrel to show the accumulated debt through the nation. I also show a green sludge pouring over the edge of the barrel because we've got $202 trillion of accumulated cost for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These are the things that are wrecking our economy. This chart, given by OMB and CBO, the Congress and the White House, both show that our economy is going to fail in 2038 because of these practices. At a time when we're starving for jobs, this administration has a war on Western jobs. It has a war on our energy. It has a war on our jobs in the timber industry. It has a war on our way of life. This is not the time to be conducting partisan politics in this town. It's a time for us to create jobs. With each job created, the 2.2 is greater because each person pays an increment more taxes, but they also are no longer receiving welfare, unemployment, and food stamps, and so the 3.5 decreases. The path forward is simple. We simply ask that the President get on board. With that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Capter, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, jobs need to be America's #1 priority. When people go back to work, it seems fairly obvious that we'll not only balance family budgets, but we'll be able to balance America's budget. They're tied together. But for some reason, too many officials here in Washington, both elected officials and those who lobby, simply haven't gotten that message. At the end of last month, the Washington Post ran an excellent piece asking, what is it about the word jobs that our nation's leaders fail to understand? How has the most painful economic crisis in modern history somehow escaped their notice? And why did they ignore issues that Americans care most desperately about? Very good questions. I've tried to answer them myself as I've fought the resistance to try to help reemploy those who seek work across our country. And I'd have to say that in some ways, some here in this city are privileged. They've really led very privileged lives. They've been insulated from living in a family that gets a pink slip, insulated from being in a family that knows what it's like to live on an unemployment check and wonder if you will ever be able to get regular checks again. Insulated from families that desperately worry when their unemployment checks expire and there is no job. A lot of people here inherited their wealth, and they truly are insulated, but for the rare few. Others had their educations paid for. They didn't work for them. It's unbelievable. There's a lot of people here just like that. Some of them always had enough to eat. They really never had to scrimp and choose whether they'd have milk, whether they'd have water, whether they split a cabbage in order to get their family through the weekend. So there really is a lot of distinction between what people have had to endure in their own lives. And frankly, there are a lot of people in this capital city that make a whole lot of money. I'm going to talk about some of them in a second. But recent polls tell us what the majority of Americans are thinking about. And according to 2 recent polls, 4 out of 10 Americans believe our country is heading in the wrong direction. I agree with them. And as gas prices rise and have climbed to record levels, 71% of our citizens are experiencing financial hardship. More cars are along the roads in Ohio where people just simply run out of gas. Or you see them at the pump and they only put in $20 and they hope that maybe a week from now the price won't be as bad. I want to dedicate my time this evening to talking about jobs, about America being held hostage to what the gentleman ahead of me was talking about, big oil, and policy changes we need to make to get our economy running strongly here at home. And I want to just point out a couple measures of our predicament so that people are thinking about different aspects of what we face so we can really fix it. Now, this first chart up here shows for the last quarter century or more, America has not had balanced trade accounts. What does that have to do with the budget deficit? When you're in the red and you're importing more than you're exporting You're having to actually borrow money to pay the difference. Somebody else is making the money off of us. We have not had balanced trade accounts since the 1970s. Every single year, more and more of America's wealth has been outsourced to someplace else. Every American knows that. You see the jobs that have disappeared from your own community. I use the Maytag Washer Company in Newton, Iowa, and I'm not from Iowa, I'm from Ohio, but I still have my old Maytags, great product. Those jobs ended up in Mexico after they were actually outsourced because of a big buyout that happened in that company. And that's happened in company after company after company. That's what's happened to all of our manufacturing jobs. But this chart here shows the U.S. trade deficit every single year. In 2010, last year, we had $500 billion more imports into our country than exports going out. This is a serious part of the problem. Now, those trade deficits result from agreements America has signed that were supposed to result in exactly the opposite, job creation in our country. Probably the best known is NAFTA. 1993, this Congress passed an agreement called NAFTA, and people who voted for it said, oh, it's going to create all these jobs in the United States, and we won't have to worry. Relations with Mexico will be terrific. Well, guess what? Ever since NAFTA passed, there hasn't been a single year when we have had even a trade balance with Mexico. No, every year our deficit with Mexico, more imports coming in here from Mexico than exports going out, has gotten worse. And what about in Mexico? In Mexico, over 35,000 citizens of that country were shot last year related to the illegal drug trade. And we are receiving the reciprocal of that across our border as people flee just to try to have a better way of life. Because you see, the farmers in that country, the smallholders, were thrown off their land as a result of NAFTA. 2 million people desperate to earn a living. We said that would happen. People didn't care. They simply didn't care. And so we lost that vote on the margin of about 12 votes. But we said what would happen in '93 has happened, and we've had over $1 trillion of trade deficit with Mexico. Now, balance of trade with South Korea. Knowing the terrible trade record that this country has had with every country we've signed one of these free trade agreements with, what is the administration proposing and the majority here proposing? They want to bring up more NAFTA-like agreements. They want to bring us Korea. They want to bring us Colombia. I don't know what else they're going to throw in. But you know what? We've already got a trade deficit with Korea. We take hundreds of thousands of their cars. They take a few thousand from us. And the agreement that the last administration and this administration has reached with Korea won't bring us trade balance with Korea. There is no requirement that it's a tit-for-tat, a reciprocal agreement where it's one car there for one car here. So we're going to lose more jobs if that agreement moves through here. This is a pattern Americans need to understand. And if you look at that overall trade deficit that's been going on and getting worse and worse every year, what is the top category of that deficit? The top category is imported oil. I agree with some of my colleagues who've pinpointed the problem. But we can't continue to hold ourselves hostage inside our own nation on the spear of petroleum. We have to support additional exploration, and we are doing that in on our own continent with the Alberta Sands Project, for example, in Canada, the largest construction project on our entire continent. But we also have to diversify. We have to be smart. Prior generations were smart. We need to be smarter. Today, the Washington Post just published an article on the latest trade numbers. They tell us a lot about our economy. There was some good news. We sold more exports and services, and why wouldn't that happen? The value of the dollar has dropped as we've hemorrhaged jobs here in this country, but a funny thing happened. The trade deficit grew again. More imported oil. High-priced oil keeps pushing us further and further in the red. That $500 billion trade deficit from last year that I referenced, according to the Manufacturing Policy Project, represents a loss of 7 million American jobs. In other words, this hole that's been accumulated over the years, 7 million manufacturing and other jobs lost across our country. That means jobs outsourced someplace else, and then they're imported here. We keep shooting ourselves in the foot over and over and over again. We can no longer afford to add hundreds of billions of dollars annually to our trade deficit. We need a different trade model that results in trade balances at a minimum and hopefully trade surpluses, because you simply can't balance our federal budget or family budgets when our trade accounts are so costly and so out of whack, and so many jobs have been moved offshore. We hear that the majority wants to bring up more NAFTA-like trade agreements, and one of the countries they're talking about is Colombia. They're talking about Korea, they're talking about Colombia. What Colombia is really about is oil. More imported petroleum, when you really get into the weeds and you look at what that agreement is about. And the question for America really is, if this is the history of imported consumption of petroleum, is that really the future that we want for this generation and the next and the following? The red lines here represent the growing share of petroleum consumption in our country that's represented by imports. It's increased steadily over the last quarter century. That is not a path for American liberty nor American economic success. We need a trade policy that is results-oriented, that results in balance and energy independence here at home. We need to grow our exports, yes, and create jobs here in our country by moving our nation toward energy independence here at home. And we need for somebody in the executive branch to stand up and fight for reciprocal trade agreements. I said that to President Obama. What's wrong with a trade surplus? What's wrong with a trade balance? Why do we keep going in the red? Why would anyone accept that as a solution for America? The unemployment rate rose this past month, I contend, because of rising gas prices. It was not good news for an economy that has been struggling to recover. And if we look back again at the last quarter century, and this chart looks a little complicated, but what it shows is that every time, the red line is oil prices. Every time oil prices peak, what follows? Higher unemployment. It's a very predictable pattern. It happened in the 1970s, twice. Here we go. High oil prices with the Arab oil embargo back in the 70s. What happened? Rising unemployment. If you go back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, same thing. Higher oil prices, higher unemployment. And certainly now, with the greatest recession since the Great Depression, an enormous rise in 2008, when the stock market crashed. What preceded it was an increase in oil prices to over $4 a gallon. And what happened? The crash. Yes, it's a housing crisis. Yes, it's an unemployment crisis. But what triggered it? Gas prices over $4 a gallon. The American people, once they understand what's happened, will fix it. America really is a hostage in her own land as a result of imported petroleum. Just as America is starting to regrow her economy now, big oil wants to steer our country back toward recession. Now, look at this chart. In the first quarter of 2011, just one of the companies, ExxonMobil, took in $10.7 billion, that's a B, in profits in one quarter. That's a 69% increase over last year. Occidental, that's the group that wants to drill more in Colombia, and they need a free trade agreement to do that and bring it in here. Their profits are up $1.6 billion, 46% increase. ConocoPhillips, $2.1 billion. Their profits up 43% in one quarter. And most of these profits are being pocketed tax-free. While working Americans earning less than $20,000 paid 15% of their income in taxes, Chevron, which made $6.2 billion in one quarter, their profits went up 36%. They only paid 4.6% in taxes on their total of $32 billion in profits last year. Now, I heard my colleague earlier talking about, oh gosh, we should really feel sorry for them, you know, because, my gosh, they're making all this money, but they need more tax preferences because they won't invest. What are they doing with all this money? These are the largest profits in American history. Oil companies aren't paying what they owe in taxes. I'll tell you one thing they're doing with their money. They're handing out handsome campaign contributions. The Koch brothers of Texas, who made a whole lot of money in that industry, generously donated more than $2 million last year and recently bankrolled Governor Walker in Wisconsin and the anti-worker movement that they're pushing in that state. Overall, the big oil and gas industry donated $27 million last year to political campaigns and, get ready, spent $146 million on lobbyists. That's over, gosh, for each member of Congress, it's like they've assigned 1 or 2 people to each one of us. No wonder Congress voted against closing $53 billion in tax loopholes to big oil. That's a 300% return on their investment, more than they can make searching for new sources of energy. In 2010, the biggest oil company, ExxonMobil, paid only 2.3% of its profits to the United States. That's scandalous, when businesses in my district are paying at a 35% corporate profit rate. And you know what? They don't ask me for all those special privileges. The businesses working hard in my region, gosh, I can think of bakeries and of factories and machine tool companies. They don't ask for special privilege. They want to help America. They want to do their fair share. But this group, they're wired in here. The year before, ExxonMobil received an $838 million tax refund. Meanwhile, those in the majority would take away unemployment benefits for working Americans. And I can tell you what, you can go across this country in the food lines, in community after community, and you know who's lined up? So many of our veterans who have come home to no work. I say, take some of this, create a civil works program, let our returning veterans lead it, and improve communities across this country. Let them take unemployed Americans and move around this nation, fixing up roads, fixing up bridges, painting up what needs to be done, reforesting, doing what Franklin Roosevelt knew how to do a century ago. Of course, you know, looking at these numbers is British Petroleum. British Petroleum, over the last 5 years, instead of paying taxes, actually took over $48 billion in tax breaks. And in the first quarter of this year, they've already made $7.2 billion more, 16% increase over what they earned last year. That's despite the terrible oil spill down in Louisiana and along the Gulf. So it's clear who the winners are. Since January, crude output has actually risen slightly, and although demand has remained steady, prices have climbed by 23%. Meanwhile, oil stock prices have risen. Just at Chevron, the stocks have risen 14%. Tax loopholes, corporate welfare, government subsidies. Does this really sound like a free market to Americans who are listening tonight? I urge my colleagues to reject more giveaways for oil companies who are raking in money by holding the American people hostage. It's time to hold them accountable. They ought to pay their fair share. Other businesses do. Americans do. Let's cut the billions of dollars in corporate welfare and focus on getting hard-working Americans back to work. We need to create jobs in this country and close those trade deficits. We need to stop outsourcing of our jobs through these so-called free trade agreements that really aren't free, and we need to move to balanced trade accounts. We need to reform the NAFTA trade model and not pass the same kind of deal for Korea or Colombia. We need reciprocal trade, not trade deficits. Our country for too long has been held hostage to these agreements. And we need energy independence to help restore our own liberty. Wouldn't it be great if we could put all Americans to work that need a job in helping to create these new sources of energy? And I know full well it is within the capability of the American people to do this. But we shouldn't put all our eggs in the basket of big oil. We ought to give them some competition on price. We ought to look at hydrogen generation facilities across this country. We have the capability to do that. We need to move into biofuels through the Department of Agriculture, working with our renewable energy community. We are fully capable of unlocking the power of the carbohydrate molecule in this century, just as we did the hydrocarbon molecule in the last. We need to bring our natural gas resources forward. We really need coal riddle and clean coal. We need to keep investing, yes, in solar and in wind power and in geothermal. We are just bringing up these technologies around the country and creating thousands and thousands of jobs. I represent one of the 3 solar platforms on the continent. And for the last, 4 decades, those who have worked in the glass industry and the silicon industry have been transforming and creating companies like First Solar, which was the hottest stock on Wall Street a couple years ago, companies that are involved in green energy production. Is it perfect yet? No, but neither was Edison's light bulb when he invented it in Milan, Ohio, where he did so much of his work, a community that I represent, and we're about to put his statue over in Statuary Hall. So America has to think about a full set of energy sources and not be so dependent on just one that, for whatever reason, lack of competition probably, but also abuse of power, has just come to play too important a role in our economy and our people. It hurts our people too many times over and over and over and over again. 50% of what we could actually save in energy comes through more judicious consumption. We've tried to provide incentives for Americans to insulate their homes, to put in new kinds of windows. There are new building materials coming on the market, insulation, new types of insulation, building your home in a manner that uses less energy in the way that it's sited on the spot, using the full energy of the sun where you can. We're much smarter about the way we are building than we were 30 or even 20 years ago, and those improvements need to continue. Imagine in America where every roof was a solar producer, where there's enough sunshine to make a difference. Imagine in America where we captured the power of the wind and properly stored it and moved it to grid. Imagine in America where what you put in your tank, if you even put something in your tank to fuel it, that it's grown and renewable in this country. Imagine in America where you could have plug-in hybrids that move around this country and our gas stations become a different type of fueling station. That is all possible. We are working through the U.S. Department of Defense, and I'll just sort of end with this, because I believe the Department of Defense knows better than any aspect of our society what we are paying as an oil hostage. Our soldiers are deployed all over the world and very close to oil reserves. I think they're worth more than that. I think their genius can be used inside the boundaries of this country to make us energy independent again. Our energy dependence is our chief strategic vulnerability. Go to the Marine Corps website. I salute the Marines. They're taking the lead inside the Department of Defense and trying to create new solutions, not just on their own bases, but as their troops move around the world. I salute the Navy. Some of the incredible inventions that they are coming up with to move power from one point to another with not a loss of 1 kilowatt. Unbelievable, some of the superconducting work that is being done inside Navy today. I congratulate the Air Force for trying new biofuels and helping push America forward in terms of its ability to power itself internally. And I salute the U.S. Army. Your work on solar tents, your work in trying to capture the power of the earth to power the systems that you are involved with today is something that is absolutely technologically amazing. You inspire us all, and there is a way for America not to be so dependent on those who would extract from us, but in fact use our genius to restore our liberty and independence again. Imagine how many jobs we could create in this country if we could bring our military back home and could spend the trillions of dollars that have been spent in oil-producing foreign lands here at home. Literally, we could rebuild the transmission grid of this country from one end to the other. We could bring up the genius of patent holders who, as we are here this evening, have ideas that can be brought to market and put that money to work for the American people. They deserve it. God bless America. God bless the future of this country. I yield back my remaining time.
The chair